Let me at the outset express my thanks to the conveners of this summer camp, Summer Institute. I am delighted to be here, and this is really my first time, so I'm looking forward to learning more about what takes place in the next day and a half. I have been tasked to talk about this very big topic: free trade arrangements, ASEAN centrality, and human rights. I am not an economist at the outset, let me tell you that. Although I was hoping that there would be some people from the ASEAN economic community, but I understand from the reception outside that so far they have not been here, so you will just have to bear with me when I talk about the AEC. But I take a lot of interest in ASEAN, our ASEAN, and how it has evolved over the last 49 years, going on 50, particularly on the concept of how it sees itself, the whole notion of the ASEAN centrality in both in the political and security arena. But of course, having learned, being an ASEAN student, we all know that when ASEAN talks about many things, one thing like centrality, or when ASEAN talks about security, it is always very much related to a number of things. Hence, when we talk about human rights, I think what is important to recognize at the outset, that whatever it is that ASEAN is supposed to be doing, we now have 3 blueprints based on the 3 pillars: the ASEAN political security community, the ASEAN economic community, and the ASEAN social and cultural community. The underlying assumption is that they're not taken on its own, that they are actually very much interrelated. Another preliminary observation is when ASEAN talks about creating a region that is peaceful, secure, prosperous, it also talks about an ASEAN that is a caring and sharing society. So there are a lot of big words out there, so to enable us, at least for me, to talk to you and to share what I think are my thoughts on these 3 big concepts, I decided to limit it to 2 key questions. And that is, to what extent does free trade, in the context of this big mega project of the ASEAN economic community, actually promote, I forgot to include protect, it should actually promote and protect human rights in the region? And second is, what does it mean when you're talking about promoting human rights through the AEC? What does it mean for ASEAN's centrality, right? So I think it is useful to begin with. I know some of you already know this, but to know why a free trade arrangement and why, right? What is it and why? And we all know from Economics 101 that the reason why people trade, the assumption is trade is always an engine for growth. So when we talk about a free trade, it's between 2 and 3. Now we have 10, and we have the 10 plus 1 and many things. The reason why people go to free trade arrangements, apart from the fact that there has been some serious delays at the multiple global level, is really because it's supposed to enhance economic growth. It's supposed to create jobs, and it's supposed to boost trade and investments, particularly for countries that are not yet plugged into the global system, economic system. If you're a country that doesn't have many resources, free trade arrangements allows for easier access to goods, easier access to services. And if you look at what they call the second generation type of free trade arrangements, these big ones like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it doesn't only talk about the free flow of goods, services, investments, etc., but it also talks about instituting certain standards. And this includes, amongst others, standards in labor and standards in environment, in order to protect the environment, minimize climate change, etc., the impact of climate change, but also to protect intellectual property, right? If you look at the ASEAN experience, we have had a number of FTAs with China, with Japan, with Korea, and this big one called ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand. And in the process of being finalized is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and of course, some members of ASEAN are also now members of this big Trans-Pacific Partnership. If you look at ASEAN's involvement with all of these FTAs and its external relations with these countries, that in a way helps us to think about ASEAN's position in the region, right? So that's why we have this whole notion of what centrality is. If you are from the ASEAN political security community, which I once served a few years back, they always talk about, you know, countries in the region always like to attend ASEAN meetings, right? So, ASEAN centrality. We convene a lot of meetings, right? We have, for example, not just the ASEAN +1 meeting. I'm talking to officials here, so you know what it is. But we have a number of ASEAN-led frameworks. So it puts us in a very, central position. And when I think about central, it's not just the ability to convene meetings, but it's actually the ability to lead. Leadership. Some people talk about the driver's seat, and I know some political scientists hate the word driver's seat, right? I don't want to go into that. But more importantly, I think when you talk about centrality, it's being able to have ideas so that we can influence the agenda of the region. ASEAN has always promoted this whole concept of a peaceful, a secure region for the observance of certain norms and practices. And in fact, this whole notion of what security is for ASEAN, comprehensive security, is not just about, by the way, protecting your states from external attacks, but it's all about, if you think about what comprehensive security is within the framework of ASEAN, it's also about, first and foremost, securing the economic security of its people, right? So if you were to study comprehensive security, and by the way, when you talk about ASEAN, when you talk about security to its other partners within the East Asia and beyond, right, it's always the emphasis on economic security. You cannot be secure unless your people are economically secure, right? So this is what essentially centrality is. I won't delve into that because I think there's a bigger concept that we have to deal with. Right, so when you say that has ASEAN done it right, when it thinks about what security is and what about human rights, this is what I talk about, the centrality of ASEAN. This is just evolving security. It's, when you talk about where ASEAN sits, this is actually a slide from Kemlu, which was presented to us when I was at the ASEAN Secretary. You see where ASEAN sits with all of these countries, right? But as I said, it's not just the fact that it is right in the center, but also centrality should also mean being able to lead when it comes to ideas. So when you think about human rights, now many of you are already familiar with this, but in the context of an economic secure region, right, it is also about ensuring that people in the region would have already would have already overcome one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest issues of human rights, and that's the denial of its economic rights, right? So, and it belongs to all, right? So if you look at, for example, what the characteristics of human rights is, I don't have to, again, go into that, but it's all that it is always interrelated. You're poor because of many other conditions. You cannot be poor, or you can be poor, or you cannot be secure if the other rights are not also guaranteed, so the indivisibility of human rights. So if I go back here, when you talk about human rights and how it has evolved in the context of the economic community, it should be that denial of poverty, right? The denial of economic security through poverty is actually a denial of your rights. All right, so much for those preliminary. Now we go to the AAC. Why is it important for ASEAN with all its ideas, right? And with all these ideas about what human rights ought to be? Why is it important that we understand its linkage to free trade agreements? Or the question, I guess, as I said earlier on, is in what ways can free trade agreements benefit human rights, okay? Now, if we go on the assumption that the reason why people trade is because it really wants to be able to boost economic development. Trade, as many economists would say, is the engine of growth, right? So if you have a free trade agreement, It is supposed to, through the movements of goods and services, investments, skilled labor, capital, you're supposed to increase your national income. And when you talk about what is this free trade agreement for anyway? For whom is it? It's not just for the state, but for its people, right? Free trade for whom? It's actually for individuals. Individuals, groups, communities. So if you have free trade, it increases prospects for income, it increases prospects for growth in your industries so that you're able to create more jobs, you're able to trade in services, allow for, some of the, whether it is in telecommunications, whether it's in medical care, whether it's in legal assistance, then you're able to open up, not just for your own people, but opportunities for other people in the region to actually work in your own countries. So you have the opening up of jobs to migrant workers, and because you want to increase your trade in goods and services, you also allow for access to very important things which some countries do not have. And I put here the example of food, because in light of the current situation we have when it comes to the impact of climate change, people need access to basic necessities like food and medicine. And that, in a way, improves the economic and the social well-being of individuals. But there's, of course, that's the good thing about free trade. Now, there's a reason why people are worried about free trade arrangements. Why? Because if you listen to what's happening now in the US in terms of its elections, people always talk about, do not have trade with China, let's not go with TPP, because there are a lot of concerns, right? So it could harm human rights if, for example, although there is increase in income, there is increased inequality, right? If there is, in fact, opening up of services, then your domestic enterprises could actually not compete. It hollows out if there's dumping of cheaper things, right? So there could be a loss of domestic jobs. And if there is, in fact, just free services without observance of certain standards, then, there's lack of provision for protection, particularly your foreign workers. But by the way, it's not just foreign workers that needs protection because of opening up of more trades, goods and services. It's also your own domestic workers. And if you follow this thing about being competitive, being able to observe common standards, including intellectual properties, then it becomes, certain things can become expensive because of IPR. And one of these things that has always been debated on when it comes to the impact of this big trade, this so-called second generation free trade agreements, is always the impact of IPR on things like medicine, for example. Okay? Now, if you were to translate some of these concerns into the ASEAN Economic Community Project, which is in 4 pillars. The ASEAN Economic Community, now I use the 4 pillars because although now we have the ASEAN Economic Community 2025, there's actually an additional pillar there, a point I will come back to later on, right? It's essentially, the idea is still the same, right? Single market and production base, having a competitive region. When you say competitive, means our industries through common standards are able to compete, right? There will be more opportunities for more innovation, and that in a way improves prospects for more balanced growth, which is the 3rd pillar, because you will then be able to create opportunities for industries, small, particularly medium-sized industries, to actually be established, providing more employment, and of course the biggest thing, which is they're all interrelated, being able to be integrated into the wider economy allows ASEAN as a region to actually extend its relations outside, conduct more, establish more free trade area, and then also secure its place, its central place, not just in the economic community, the wider economic community, but the wider, integrated international community. Okay? Now, if you look at the first single market and production base, what are some of the concerns, or what are the advantages that AEC brings, right? If you see that trade actually improves prospects for growth, because trade, as this mantra that's given to us by most economists, is actually the driver for growth. In the last 10 years, ASEAN's performance as far as poverty reduction is concerned is actually not too bad, right? You can see everything, there's a downward trajectory. There's also a table here that shows, and I'll go through this briefly because I'm conscious I'm only going to speak for 25 minutes, but there's actually a reduction in poverty across the board, okay? But we all know that reduction in poverty is not necessarily too good if you have inequality, right? And the reason why there is inequality is, of course, that not everyone is able to participate in the robust economic activity that free trade arrangements is supposed to engender. And if you look at this, for example, two cases, by the way, the slide is being circulated, so just for the purpose of illustration, there's actually an increase in inequality over time. And this is not just unique to Southeast Asia. As I said earlier on, if you listen to some of the debates that's happening now during elections, people always talk about imbalanced growth, but there's a lot of people that have been marginalized, left to the sides. They have not been participatory, they have not benefited from the so-called the profits, the benefits of closer global integration, right? So that's one problem. Now the other thing about single market and production base, as I said earlier, is that it actually allows for movements of skilled labor. There's not much discussion about unskilled, but it's also an assumption, right? Because if you look at the way it's done in the ASEAN economic pillar, there's a mode 4 that it actually allows for services to flow, and with more services, it's also more opportunity for labor. But there are instances, and this has been a major concern. His Excellency, Chair of the Migrant Workers, has mentioned a figure earlier on about 6 million foreign workers in the region. And I would imagine it's slightly low, because just in one country alone, there are about 1 to 2 million irregular foreign workers. So I'm not sure whether it includes the undocumented one. But this is many of the issues that have surfaced, and we are not a stranger to this issue. You open up more opportunities, but you also suppress wages because you want to be competitive, right? There has been issues of, for example, foreign workers not aware of their rights, that their salaries are actually withheld. It's not only low, but some of them are withheld because they have to pay for their agents that have allowed them to go from their country to work in another country. They work in not so pleasant conditions, poor working condition, working in very long hours. There's been incidents of forced labor and trafficking. There's a panel later on about trafficking. There's a case, for example, a country in our region that's famous for human trafficking, using human trafficked people in the fishing industry. It's actually quite a lamentable situation, right? There's physical abuse, there's no access to medical services, and labor laws in certain countries provide little protection. I mean, this is some of the issues that have evolved. So you do have these movements of labor, but unless you are familiar with some of the things that are being flagged out there, right? This whole thing about allowing a region to have more freer flow of labor can be problematic. Okay, see that? When you talk about making a region more competitive, for making it, allowing for more capital, more investments, allowing other companies to come in, there's also the concern that some of your local industries will be hollowing out because they cannot compete. And I put here a quote by an economist in Myanmar, which basically said that businesses do not meet product quality and will not be able to make important market commission. It's an admission of some of the inadequacies, right, faced by certain countries that may not actually have the capacity to step up to the requirements of an economic community, right? And also, if we are in fact going to be more observant of intellectual property rights, there's also this concern, right, that greater access to medical care, especially for medicines, may provide more expensive for many people unless there are enough safety nets provided for by governments, right? Food and other commodities can become, in fact, more expensive. Okay? We'll skip that. Now, equitable economic development. It's not all bad, actually, as some, because when you talk about the benefits and concerns about the economic community, there are, of course, the pluses. And I talked earlier about when you talk having an equitable economic development by ensuring that there's enough support for your medium-sized industries. And if you look at some of the data, it actually shows that this is the SMEs in the region that's providing the biggest employment across the board, right? This is not so clear, but if you look at the slides, it shows that in countries like Laos, PDM, Myanmar, and Vietnam, the highest employer is actually your small, medium-sized industries. Vietnam has been cited by the World Bank as one of the highest growth in SMEs and micro-industries, right? So there is that opportunity for more jobs in in the smaller scale industries. And the last pillar, when you talk about integration into the global economy, there's another issue that's not often talked about. But it's not just a question of ASEAN countries, all 10, being part of the wider global supply chain. It's also about being able to actually observe some of the international standards and global standards when it comes to, for example, protection of your workers and the policy of non-discrimination, right? So when you are part of this wider global economic community, there are certain things that have to be borne in mind, and that is you have to align your standards with other countries. For example, non-discrimination. There is also that impetus to ensure that your workers are respected and that their rights are actually respected, promoted, and protected. That you also observe international labor conventions, particularly when it comes to wages. And what it means is that when you talk about advancing the ASEAN economic community, particularly the AEC 2025, right, that what are the things that have been brought into ASEAN? For example, the Declaration of Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers must be implemented, right? That when you talk about the latest one, the new convention on against trafficking, especially of women and children, when you have a more robust economic community with all those concerns, you are compelled to actually ensure that these are all implemented. Right? So what does it say? So if you were to sort of look at the concerns and the advantages of what the AEC is to human rights, at the country level, as mentioned earlier, there are prospects for reduction of poverty. We have seen that. But there's also the concern about increased inequality that could harm human rights. I'm almost there. That while we encourage intellectual property, it could actually mean lesser access for people when it comes to certain important goods and commodities. At the firm level, there are concerns that your smaller firms will hollow out unless there is a conscious effort by the state, by the governments to support them, right? But at the same time, you actually therefore help the creation of more small, medium-sized enterprises that actually provide the greatest employment to your people. And at the individual level, you can have more prospects for jobs for migrants, but unless conventions, regional and global, are observed, you have the problems of abuses of human rights and other things. Okay? So, if you look at ASEAN Economic Community 2015 and 2025, to me, what is most striking is the letters that I put in red. ASEAN, when you talk about the ASEAN community, it's not just in the AEC when you talk about a cohesive community. It's also in the ASCC, ASEAN Social Cultural Community, right? A dynamic ASEAN, when there is enhanced connectivity, right? It all talks about, at the very heart of it, the aim of an economic community which is supposed to improve, right, the lives of people, regardless of their status. So what is the main difference of the ASEAN Economic Community 2015 to 2025 is an iteration. I said iteration because if you happen to think about ASEAN in 2005, 2006, it's always been there. It's supposed to be people-centered ASEAN. But 2025 blueprint puts it back there as another important pillar. Because if you were to maintain your centrality, a region, an association that's supposed to be respected because of its leadership and ideas, you must have it. You have to be able to include, to bring and to highlight the main referent of your economic enterprise, which is the communities, the societies, and the people of ASEAN, right? And for ASEAN to be taken seriously in the global community, then centrality of ASEAN also talks about having common positions. I call it a chorus, being able to have a chorus of common concerns. That if ASEAN is not mindful of some of the concerns, that an economic integration, a country or a community that is integrated with the global economy, if it is not conscious about the welfare and the issues that faced by ordinary individuals, right, then it cannot be truly a global ASEAN. Okay? So it is important that if any, for the lack of word, if there's any project, any enterprise, or any idea that ASEAN has for its community, a peaceful and secure community, one that is prosperous, all this will be meaningless if the main referent of all these ideas, which is, of course, the ASEAN people, is not able to benefit from it because ASEAN as a region and an individual, at the individual country level, is not sensitive to or mindful to some of the concerns, human rights concerns of many people, of the ASEAN people. So I always put this there. Okay? If ASEAN is to maintain its centrality, then it must have leadership beyond words and into action. It is therefore incumbent on individual ASEAN members to ensure that some of these concerns are addressed. Right? If there are concerns about marginalization, increased concerns about imbalanced growth, there should be more focus on social safety nets, observance and commitment to the promotion of rights, and the whole idea of what human security is, so that you're able to achieve a caring, sharing society, community that is peaceful and prosperous. Because at the end of the day, when we talk to our, if you're an official, if you want to talk about ASEAN Economic Community or ASEAN Sociocultural Community or the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, they'll ask you, for whom are all these projects for? Right? AEC for whom? FTA for whom? And ASEAN for whom? Thank you very much.